Thanks, Guy. And yes, I'm delighted to be able to talk about some of our key findings from Innovating to Net Zero 2026. Now, I don't need to tell this audience this, but first of all, I'm going to do a recap of what energy system flexibility is and why it's important. So ultimately, it's the balancing of supply and demand, and in the case of the electricity system, that has to happen in real time. This ensures system security, both in terms of making sure we have the energy we need when we need it, but also allowing the electricity network to operate within its required parameters. It allows greater integration of renewable generation, which lowers costs and helps consumers develop low-carbon solutions, and supports economic growth through the development of great products by many of you in the room today. But how do we assess the requirements for flexibility? We think the answer is the peak gaps. So traditionally, we thought about peak demand. What's the maximum demand that we have to meet? But if that coincides with lots of wind generation, that's a completely different situation to when there's lots less. So we're considering the gap. So this is the difference between demand and renewable supply plus firm generation, such as nuclear. And we think there's 4 electricity gaps and then a 5th gap that I will come to. So when thinking about flexibility requirements, there's within-day balancing and then there's between-day balancing. So in terms of within-day balancing, we first of all think about the peak power gap. This is the instantaneous difference between supply and demand over the course of a day. And this identifies the power required for within-day flexibility. So this tells us how much power we're going to need at any given moment. But it's not just the amount of power. How long do we need that for? How much energy does that translate to? So we also have the peak energy gap. That's the difference between supply and demand over 6 hours. And that identifies the energy required for within-day flexibility. So if we know those 2 things, we know how much flexibility we need within a day. That's great. But the energy system doesn't just run for a day, obviously. So we need to be able to balance the system between days. And to do that, first of all, we have the peak daily gap. That is the largest difference between average daily demand and average daily supply of power. And that identifies the power required for between-day flexibility. And then we have the peak duration gap. So now this is looking at the energy required. If we have one day when we have less energy than we need, then another day and another day, how does that stack up? And to identify these gaps, we looked at 40 years of historical weather data. And we actually found that 2 weeks was the period where you saw the lowest and longest extended period of low renewable generation. So after that, we looked at 4 weeks. Typically, there were periods in that when renewable generation was higher. So we've picked a 2-week peak durational gap. And that identifies the energy required for between-day flexibility. But of course, we don't just have to think about electricity. So when we come to heat, as I'm sure we're all aware, most of our winter days are wet and mild, very wet. But we still get those really cold days. And so we have the peak heat gap. And it's focused on heat, and this is the difference between typical winter demand and demand over a cold spell. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we've got the peak gaps, great. But how do we assess the requirements for those peak gaps? So we've developed 4 future energy system scenarios using our energy system models. We have ESME, the energy systems modeling environment, which builds those future energy systems. And then we have ESME Flex, which is our dispatch model and looks to operate those systems. And these scenarios range in terms of their pace and deployment of renewable energy and flexibility from scenarios that align with Clean Power 2030, so deploy renewable energy very quickly, such as a further offshore wind or high renewable scenario, to something like steady transition, which decarbonizes more slowly. And we found that low carbon flexibility alongside renewable generation can reduce energy system cost. So in our high renewables and further offshore wind scenarios, we saw cost savings of around 1.5% or 70 billion by 2050 compared to steady transition. But these scenarios that had more renewable energy needed more low carbon flexibility. And if we're going to get that flexibility, that requires innovation to deliver that, to make sure we can get that. If we don't get that and we end up with less renewables, then we see alternatives like unabated gas generation being used more, and that helped hike the cost up. And then, I'm sure it's the same for many people in this room, I've often been in discussions around what's more important. Is it renewable energy or is it nuclear generation? And actually what we find is the 2 complement each other to drive costs down. So in our analysis, we see a requirement for at least 25 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2040, and that's made up of both large and small-scale reactors. And if we think back to those peak gaps, what that essentially does is it brings up that supply line. So that supply line is higher, demand hasn't changed, so you make the gap smaller. And in fact, in the peak duration gap, we saw that reduced by around 10 terawatt hours. So to explore this a little bit further, we ran sensitivities. I'm a modeler, I love a good sensitivity. So we ran sensitivities where we allowed no new nuclear generation. And what we saw is that there was an additional requirement for gas with CCS at around 10 gigawatts and additional offshore wind at around 15 gigawatts. And these helped increase costs by 1.1% or around 50 billion by 2050. So starting to think about the flexibility requirements, first of all, thinking about within day, so that's the requirement set by the peak power and energy gaps. We find that static batteries are essential to balancing supply and demand, and they're cycling daily to meet peak demands across all seasons. And just taking a minute to explain this chart. So it's over 168 hours, to most people a week, and we have generation which is positive, so above the x-axis, and then below it we have demand, which is negative. And then in the glorious catapult pink, we've got batteries, so both generating and obviously charging up. And they are charging during times of low demand and then dispatching during peak. And we find that during a winter hourly peak, they can meet around 33% of demand by 2030. Now by 2040, that goes down to 24%. And that's because we see demand increasing, but we don't see an increase in battery deployment beyond 2030. But that only happens if EV flexibility reaches its potential. So thinking about EVs, flexibility provided by EVs is especially valuable to the energy system because the cost of that vehicle isn't carried by the energy system. Consumers are buying electric vehicles because they see it as a good proposition to get from A to B. And with up to 30 million EVs on the road by 2040, these provide flexibility daily, shifting up to 49 gigawatts of their own demand away from evening peak, so smart charging essentially. But realising this ambition would depend on compelling consumer propositions, including market signals. No consumer is buying an EV because they want to provide flexibility to the energy system. They're buying an EV because they want to get from A to B and they want to do it in a cost-effective way. We need propositions that is going to persuade and convince people to use their EVs to provide flexibility. And indeed, Becky's panel discussion this afternoon will be thinking more about how we get consumer propositions correct. And then looking into this in a little bit more detail, so as well as the EV smart charging here, we also have wind and solar generation for an example summer week in 2040. And what we see is the smart charging is happening either overnight or because this is a summer week, some of that is moving into the day to align with the increase in generation as we get solar generation during the middle of the day. The other thing we find is that typically, the average daily mileage is around 20 miles, and a typical battery range is over 200 miles. So EVs don't need to charge daily. So what we see here is in the sort of first half of the week, when there's greater wind generation, the smart charging is being still away from peaks, but it's being prioritized in the first half of the week because there's more generation available. But EVs don't just provide flexibility by shifting their demand. By 2040, they could be providing around 350 gigawatt hours of energy in a single week to the grid via vehicle-to-grid. Now, like smart charging, vehicle-to-grid avoids adding system costs, but its ability to supply demand makes it even more valuable. So it's not just shifting demand, it's actually providing power to the network. But again, there is an urgency to develop the infrastructure and vehicle standards needed to turn this potential into reality and help consumers to take it up. Consumers are not going to take it up if we don't have the right propositions and incentives in place. So moving away from within-day flexibility to think a little bit about between-day flexibility. So that's the requirements set by the peak daily gap and the duration gaps. We find that by 2040, unabated gas generation will still be important for energy security, with at least 20 gigawatts still present in the system, but it's only used to help meet those peak gaps. Now, given the low utilization, market mechanisms will be needed to ensure gas turbines remain available for peak demand and system resilience, for example, some form of strategic reserve. And hydrogen turbines will also be important in meeting demand during these peak gaps. And we see up to 13 gigawatts by 2040, and that can provide up to 35% of the capacity needed to bridge the daily gap. But if we're going to reach that level of deployment by 2040, we need to be testing hydrogen turbines at scale really soon, by 2030, if we're going to get to that level of scale up. And it's not just hydrogen turbines. Alongside these turbines, we see large-scale hydrogen storage being needed, up to 6 terawatt hours by 2040, tripling to 18 terawatt hours by 2050. Now, I recognise this is smaller than what's been suggested in some other studies, but at this point, I don't think that matters too much. The point is we need terawatt hours of storage. So let's get those early terawatt hours and then consider what we need after that. At the moment, I think we have around 25 gigawatt, so not terawatt hours, 25 gigawatt hours of hydrogen storage deployed in this country, and that's for chemical storage. That's not being used for the chemical industry. It's not being used to provide power. So yes, more work needed in this area, but the priority is get those initial terawatt hours. And if we're going to do that, and again, alongside hydrogen turbines, then we need demonstrators of an end-to-end whole system solution. So don't just test turbines or test production or test storage. You need to test it all together. You need to look at the whole value chain and the benefits that can bring. Now, up till now, I've been talking about power, but actually, heat demand makes up about a third of total energy consumption. So it's really important to think about heat flexibility as well. And one area that we think will become increasingly important for providing heat is heat networks. And the way these can be most valuable is if we combine them with large-scale thermal storage. So, and what that allows to happen, as this chart shows, is heat demand is not constant. Like every other demand, it will vary. And if we have the thermal storage, we can charge the storage in the troughs in demand, use it to meet the peaks, and that means the source of that heat supply, be that waste heat or nuclear cogeneration, whatever it is, that can be sized at a more steady level. It doesn't have to be sized to meet the peaks. And that lowers the size and therefore lowers the total cost. Now, currently, thermal storage often takes the form of large hot water tanks, but emerging options such as molten salt, phase change materials, and sand batteries could play a role if costs fall. And it's not just thermal storage with district heat networks, which is important. Thermal storage in residential and commercial buildings can help reduce daily peaks in heat demand. And we see this rising from around 50 gigawatt hours of mainly unsmart hot water tanks to nearly 200 gigawatt hours of fully connected smart storage. And that's equivalent to around 20 million households. So that's a massive upscaling deployment that needs to be worked on. So when we were looking at the gaps, I sort of briefly mentioned the peak heat gap. Now, as I said, typically our winters are wet, but we do get cold spells, and that can drive heating demand up by 2.5 terawatt hours per day. And that essentially creates a peak heat gap. And also it tends to coincide because it's cold when heat pumps and renewables are least effective. Now, this is one of the biggest flexibility challenges to the energy system, but it is also one of the biggest opportunities for innovation. So for example, heat pumps that perform better in cold weather, large-scale, high-quality efficiency upgrades, heat network expansion, and significant industrial flexibility can all help to bridge that peak gap. Now, if we don't achieve this innovation, difficult options remain, and that includes retaining 50 gigawatts of electricity peaking plant just to support meeting that peak heat gap, retaining gas with hybrid heating, and behaviour change to manage colder homes. Now, somewhere where there's been lots of discussion and lots of uncertainty recently is around our future data centre demand, and this is something we've been thinking about, but absolutely acknowledge there's still more work to do. We expect data centres to be responsible for 5% of electricity demand by 2040. But again, these provide an opportunity. There are flexibility options there. So this could be through load shifting, on-site storage of generation, or cooling flexibility. For example, can we take some of that heat away to cool the system, store it in thermal storage, combined with a local heat network? Now, one thing that's important to recognise here is a data center is not a data center, right? There are different types of data centers providing different roles. And that means they will all have different abilities to provide, or different suitabilities to providing flexibility. But despite that, they all have facility-led demand. So away directly from the sort of IT and the compute, there will be cooling, UPS, other power requirements which have potential to be shifted. And then AI is essential for enabling a smarter, more flexible solution. AI advances, particularly data processing, machine learning, and forecasting, are critical enablers of the future energy system. Key areas where AI can support include forecasting of renewable generation, optimization to improve system control and balancing, which can in turn reduce costs and automation. And automation specifically will help to enable up to 76 gigawatts of consumer-led electricity flexibility. Now, we've been working on the advice program, so that's delivered by the Energy Systems Catapult Digital Catapult alongside the Alan Turing Institute on behalf of DESNZ. and this aims to maximise benefits of AI solutions in solving UK industry's most critical decarbonisation challenges. And it's identified 2 challenge areas where AI can accelerate net zero. So that's maximising flexibility in energy networks and optimising EV infrastructure. So please do go and check that project out. It's a really interesting one. And then to unlock flexibility, we need coordinated policy, regulatory, and industry action. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these dots, but this ranges from things that are relatively quick wins that can happen really quickly, so that's helping investing in consumer understanding, to things that might be longer-term changes, such as a transition towards a strategic reserve for unabated gas generation. And as I said, I will leave you to explore these points in more detail, but I guess the key point here is lots of action needed, lots of it very quickly, and across multiple organisations. So it shows the scale and urgency of the interventions that are needed and needed now. And speaking about exploration in more detail, before I finish speaking, I'd like to give you a quick tour of the data we are also making available from the project. So we've provided a visualizer. This is on the website. I've been told not to take it off this tab, so I won't, but as you can see, we've got consumption, so you can look at what we think future electricity consumption will be, generation capacity, how that's broken down by technologies, and how we see hydrogen storage growing. We've then also got dispatch, which is what we're showing here. So again, this is for typical weeks. So we're currently on a winter week for 2030 for that handily came up, I believe it's the further offshore wind. There you go. So you can scroll through it. We can look at, so on the 101st hour, someone else can work out what day that is, we had 58.2 gigawatts of wind. You can filter through technologies, so you can change technologies, and you can jump through scenarios and years. So if we go to 2040, so you can see, as you'd expect, the system has changed. There's now, for example, more nuclear in the system. So you can go through, and it gives you a chance to explore the assumptions we've made and why we've come to what we have. As finally shows, so we can alternate. So this is one of the gaps. So again, please do explore it in your own time. If there's any questions, do come and grab me in one of the breaks. Thanks for your time.